Welcome back. In this video, we're going to discuss safeguards that have been put into place in an attempt to prevent ethical abuses from taking place. Specifically, within this video, we are going to identify the core components of informed consent. We're going to discuss when aspects of informed consent can be waived, and we're going to discuss the ethical concerns that arise when researching vulnerable populations.
Okay, so let's get started. So let's do a deeper dive into respect and informed consent. So this is review. So you may recall that respect for persons requires that researchers and REBs respect the autonomy of research participants and protect those who lack the capacity to make their own decisions. And you may recall that consent is the means by which individuals express their willingness to participate in research, and consent must be voluntary, ongoing, informed, accessible, and documented. And today we're going to unpack each of these requirements. Consent must be voluntary. So real or perceived threats of coercion and/or the presence of undue influence can undermine the voluntariness of consent. My teenagers love to play this game like, what would you do? And then they ask me something like, would you rather a snail crawl across your tongue or you like have to kiss a spider on the furry parts? And I'm like, neither. And then they're like, gun to your head, what would you do? And I'm like, who's gonna put a gun to my head and ask me to do this? The kids, right? So if we ever have a situation in research where we're saying gun to the head, no, that is coercion, okay? So we can't do that. Now, here's another fun game. So we see these memes, and my kids, again, are always showing me these things. So for $10, would you stay in this room for 3 full days? All right. I'm hearing a firm no. Right? The dynamic changes. Okay, so this very clearly illustrates that we may have lines that we draw, but those lines are movable. Okay? So we may be very willing to do something for $1 million that we are not willing to do for $5 or $10. So researchers are allowed to offer incentives for research participation. That SciAO1 and SciAO2 students are offered sort of the opportunity to earn bonus points in their class as an incentive. Researchers are allowed to pay research participants for their time. What a research ethics board has to do is it has to determine, is that a fair compensation of a person's time and energies, or is it an inducement that might change somebody's willingness to consent versus not consent? Okay, so if you see this and you say, no, thank you, you're making a truly informed decision, right? This is voluntary consent. When I say, for $1 million, would you do this? You are adding a really strong external pressure that may change your ability to feel like you can voluntarily say, no, I don't want to do this thing that makes me feel uncomfortable. So in research, we never want our incentives to be so big that somebody's afraid to say no to something that's going to make them uncomfortable. Okay, so consent must be voluntary. So typically when we're referring to coercion, we're referring to compelling somebody to act using pressure, threats, or force. And when you go back to those historical case studies, many of those do involve force, right? So if we look at the nutrition studies, for example, those children were forced to be in residential schools. They were forced to be in these studies without their knowledge. So there is a coercive effect present. Undue influence isn't necessarily using threats, negative things, but instead some kind of positive inducement. So compelling somebody to act via rewards, incentives, or approval. So one of our case studies looks at what happens when researchers want to use their own children in research studies. And of course, most children want to please their parents, right? They don't want to have the disapproval of their parents. So we have to ask questions. If your boss asks you to do something, are you going to fear that there might be some kind of negative consequence to that? Or are you doing it just because you want to gain that person's approval? Okay, so again, consent must be informed. So what do we mean by this? Well, informed consent is at heart this idea that people should be informed of what they will be doing as research participants, fully informed, and should be given the freedom to decide based on that information if they wish to participate or not. It also informs participants of their rights. So even if you agree to be part of a study, you are free to decline participation at any point in time. So again, if we come back to our Belmont criterion, participants need to be told what is the study purpose. They need to be told who is conducting the study, and they need to be told what are the benefits and risks to the research participant. And from a justice perspective, this comes back to this who is included versus excluded, right? So if this is a treatment that's thought to be beneficial, why are some people being excluded from it? If this is a study that is thought to have certain risks, why are only some participants being recruited? And then again, respect for people's rights and dignities, reminding people of those rights. Consent must also be ongoing. So in most cases, consent is initiated before the data is collected. And in most cases, the Research Ethics Board is going to look to see, have you put into place some kind of formal consent process? It doesn't always have to be a written informed consent. It could be a verbal conversation. It could be implicit consent. There are a variety of ways that this formal consent process should occur. But participants should be informed about the nature of the research study before they agree to participate in it.
So another question that we can ask ourselves is the question of whether informed consent is always required. For example, if we want to study a topic like lying, telling research participants that we are studying lying behaviors could definitely change their behaviors, which could impact the outcomes of the study. Or maybe we want to observe people in some kind of naturalistic setting. If we were to walk up to those individuals to ask them if they want to be observed, that could definitely change their behaviors. For this reason, there are some unique circumstances where a research ethics board might agree to waive certain aspects of informed consent. When researchers are not able to fully inform participants of the true purpose of the study prior to collecting data, this is called deception. Most studies in psychology involve some degree of deception, and that the researchers will typically tell the research participants the general purpose of the research study, the types of things that the research participants will be doing as part of the study, and what kinds of benefits and risks are involved. But the researchers typically do not tell the research participants about the exact research question or hypothesis. There are cases, however, where researchers may need to be even more deceitful than this. One of these situations occurs when researchers are conducting experimental research that involves some kind of treatment condition versus a control condition. As we will discuss later in the term, it's not uncommon for researchers to want to keep participants unaware of whether they are in the treatment condition versus the control condition, because the mere belief that one is getting some kind of treatment could change a person's behavior. For this reason, researchers will often give participants in a control condition a placebo. A placebo is some kind of pseudo-treatment that looks, feels, and acts the same as a treatment, but it lacks the active ingredient. So, for example, if you were studying the effectiveness of a new vaccine, you might inject the members of the treatment group with the real vaccine while injecting members of the control group with a saline solution. You then wouldn't tell either the people whether they were in the treatment group or the placebo group. Obviously, this kind of deception raises some serious ethical concerns. Therefore, if a researcher wishes to use deception, they must explain to the Research Ethics Board why it is methodologically necessary to do so, and they have to explain why there isn't an alternative method that could be used to answer the same research question without the use of deception. And they also must agree to implement their consent process in stages. So prior to the start of the study, the participants would go through an informed consent process where they are given as much information as possible, but also informed that not all aspects of the study are being revealed to them at that point in time. So in the example that I just used around that vaccine study, participants would be informed that they may be assigned to the treatment group or the control group, and that they will be given either a real vaccine or a placebo, but that they will not know until the end of the study whether they received the treatment or the control. Then, at the end of the research study, the participants would go through a debriefing process. Debriefing is the process of informing research participants of the purpose of the study, revealing any deception that did occur, and correcting for any misconceptions that might have resulted as a consequence of that deception. Debriefing also involves minimizing any harms that might have occurred. So if you are doing some kind of vaccine efficacy study and you discover that the vaccine is effective, at the end of the study, you would then offer the participants in the control condition access to that effective vaccine. There are also some situations where the requirement for informed consent could be waived altogether. For example, informed consent may not be required if a researcher wants to analyze documents or information that is legally or publicly accessible with no expectation of privacy. So if you want to access government documents or if you want to analyze television shows, you can do those things without having to get informed consent from the people that created that media or that are in that media. Researchers may also be able to waive certain aspects of informed consent if they're using secondary analysis of anonymously collected data, biological materials, or other such information that maybe was collected by one research team, but then de-identified and anonymized in order to be shared with other researchers. Lastly, in some situations, the researcher may be able to get a waiver of informed consent if they want to observe people in public settings in some kind of non-obtrusive way. So let me ask you a question. What do you think counts as a non-obtrusive observation? This turned out to be a question that was discussed at length in the mid-70s after a group of researchers conducted a study in a public setting that was designed to test the hypothesis that the invasion of personal space will change the speed and flow of urination. Let's learn more about that study.
Okay, so this was an actual research study published in an actual scientific journal, Middle Mist, Knowles, and Matter in 1976. So the question, the key theoretical question is, does the invasion of personal space change the speed and flow of urination? So it gets sort of at this basic question of, does stress influence us physiologically? Okay, right? So it's not a law, right? There's no clearly stated rule that says that you must do this, but there is a clear informal rule that if you walk into a washroom and somebody is standing at, say, urinal A, then you should go to urinal C. So these researchers took advantage of these implicit rules of engagement to examine how a violation of that personal space might influence the extent to which somebody is actually physically able to perform the act of urinating. Okay, so one researcher, I had fun with the clip art for this. Okay, so Why is he holding a water bottle? Because every clip art that I could find with a stopwatch was like in a sports-oriented thing. But maybe you need to stay hydrated. Okay, so the research assistant hides, literally hides in a stall. Okay, so the door is closed, you can't see you can maybe see feet, but you can't see what the person's doing, just like you would in a stall. And this person has a stopwatch, okay? And then I refuse to answer any questions about the clip art. All right, each person that came in to use the urinal was a research participant in the study. Okay, now I've probably talked about this idea, but in some types of research, it's not uncommon to use what's called a confederate, which is this person who's working for the research study, but pretending to either be a research participant or just pretending to be a member of the crowd. So in this case, a second researcher joins the participant at the urinal under one of two experimental conditions. Okay, so either the researcher uses the one stall rule and puts one urinal space between himself and the participant. Okay, so this is the control condition. Or the researcher stands right next to the participant and violates this informal social rule. So immediately some clear ethical concerns are coming up, right? So we did our top hat activity. The very first word that comes up in like huge bold letters is consent. And now we're asking ourselves, did they get consent? What do you think? No. Do you think it would change the nature of the study if they got consent? Absolutely. Okay, so it gets better. Guy with stopwatch. He listens for the commencement of urination and times how long it takes for the participant to start peeing, and also how long it takes to finish the act of peeing. Yes.
How did the observer disambiguate between the first urination and the second urination?
Yeah. This was a problem. So you want to hear the solution? You asked. You asked. Is my face red? All right. So in response to critiques about the measurement validity of the study, in one version of the study, the researcher even used a mirror to visually observe the stream. All right. So we know that there are certain circumstances under which we may not require informed consent. Only if, again, in collaboration with the REB, only if there's strong methodological reasons for doing it, there's no more than minimal risk to participants, and all data has to be collected anonymously. So if the study involves naturalistic observation of participants in a public context where a person could reasonably be expected to be seen, then typically, and all these other things are in place, then the Research Ethics Board might approve for you to waive consent. So would you waive consent requirement in this context? Yeah, probably not, right? We've already agreed that there's an ickiness to this study that just doesn't feel right.
So to summarize our discussion of informed consent, we want to keep in mind that informed consent should be voluntary, it shouldn't be coerced, it should be informed. For the most part, participants should be informed about the nature of the study and the risks and benefits of participating in it before they participate. It should be ongoing in the sense that participants have the right to choose to withdraw their participation at any point in time. And returning to our definition of respect, we need to remember that informed consent is not just about respecting the autonomy of research participants. It's also about protecting those who lack the capacity to make their own decisions. And this question of vulnerability becomes really, really important when we're talking about individuals who may not have the capacity to provide informed consent for themselves, and when we're talking about um, marginalized individuals who may have been excluded from the research planning and research design process in the past. These vulnerabilities not only raise important questions about respect, they also raise important questions about justice and responsibility. Who should be doing research on vulnerable populations? And how should the potential power dynamics between researchers, who are often in positions of power, and research participants, who may lack this power, best be addressed? We can return to the Indigenous values framework from earlier to help us think through these complexities. Similar to the Belmont Report, respect is a core hallmark of the Indigenous values framework. And across both models, respect is rooted in the idea that people should be free, autonomous agents. Similarly, the Belmont Report and the Indigenous Values Framework both focus on responsibility as a core value. Earlier, when we talked about the ethical dilemmas that can arise when weighing the desire to protect the privacy of research participants on one hand, with a researcher's legal obligations and duties to report on the other hand, we defined responsibility in terms of adherence to societal laws and standards. The Indigenous Values Framework challenges us to expand that definition to be more explicit that research should not just be conducted in adherence to societal laws and standards, but in direct collaboration with the members of the communities and societies that the researcher is studying. Indeed, to ensure the reciprocal benefit and relevance of research to scientists and community members, researchers should work in partnership with communities to build trust and collaboration. This is especially true when working with populations, such as Canada's Indigenous population, who have been historically harmed and abused by scientific systems.